In chapter 1 of your book, the very first chapter, it says, "How many isms do you understand?" is the name of the first chapter. And in this, you talk about Ludwig von Mises and how he observed that there are two methods for the conduct of affairs within the frame of human society: peaceful cooperation among men. One is bureaucratic management. The other is profit management. And so this chapter, you talk about force versus freedom. And so what's so wrong about organizing society around force?
Well, in Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in the 70s, and he said there's only one alternative to free markets: force. Some people telling other people what to do. The problem with what I would call centralized force in a centralized government is that who's controlling that force? That's the key. Who controls it? I'll never forget, we were sitting around the university coffee table one afternoon, and where there was a time when the country was kind of in an economic mess, and there was a little pause in the conversation. Somebody said, "What we need is a benevolent dictator."
Yeah.
And there was a little pause, and I piped up and said, now to find a benevolent dictator. So that's the key. When you have force concentrated, generally in a central government, somebody's going to be in control of that force. And that somebody may not be pleasant.
Well, we've seen this. That made me think of a very recent example of this. In Seattle, you had this militant group kind of take over the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And what happened? There was a power vacuum that was created, and then what happened? Immediately, you had basically a warlord declare that he had control over it.
Someone is going to take over in a situation like that.
So I think they may have been aiming for 1776, but really they landed among Lord of the Flies. I think is more how it actually turned out. So
well, and that brings up the very fact, and I mentioned in my book, that one of the keys to economic growth and development is an orderly society. And what we have today, we're seeing some disorder in some of our major cities. And one of the other points I make is that an orderly society depends upon a justice system that's correct, a police system, fire system. And so we're defunding the very organizations and individuals that help provide the order. If you don't have order, it's like we go to Venezuela. You don't have order down there. The economy is really in terrible shape. And wherever you find that, economic growth is going to be zero or negative.
Absolutely. You have to have, and I think it was Barry Asmus. He told me about the book.
I remember that.
Yeah, he told me about the book that was it Hernando de Soto, I think, wrote one. I can't remember, but anyway, that was one of his main points in his book, is that capitalism works primarily because of private property rights. In order to have those, you have to have a system in place to protect those rights.
So, and private property is one of the keys to a free market system, where people can own their own property, they own their own materials and assets. And without that, then you have, a classic example is Russia. Russia's had ample resources. I've got all that petroleum, and it should be a rich country. But when you actually look outside the big cities, you see a lot of poverty and a lot of lack of economic development there, because those resources have not been managed properly.
No, not at all. I remember hearing a story of we're going to talk about prices probably here in a minute, I think, but whenever you have a centralized government like that controls the buying and selling, they have to set prices, and so a lot of times they will borrow from free markets to see what the prices are over there to set their own prices. And it's just it's just so fun. Why don't you just let the price mechanism work?
Classic example. When I was in Russia in 1991. It was a situation where they still had lines for meat and bread and milk in Moscow, and it's just amazing to see that when you come to the United States. As I mentioned in my book, we'd all been out of shape. We had to wait an extra 2 or 3 minutes, and they're waiting for hours for the basics. Now, when they bought the basics, the prices were very low, but then there was no incentive to create the basics. And I have to tell the story it's in the book there about the story of a visiting American economics professor, and he was observing the slow pace of work in Russia. And so he asked one of the workers, he said, "Why do you work so slow?" And he said, "Well, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." And that in this country, that doesn't work. People are out there working hard and trying to develop their skills and their abilities and their business.
Well, it reminds me of a quote from a recent presidential candidate who said, "What's wrong with bread lines? People are lining up for that's good, but that's." I don't think he's quite getting it. In America,
Exactly.
people line up to give us bread. In other countries, they have to line up,
Exactly.
To get it, and it's just doesn't go.
Well, we saw that back during the Great Depression when basically the government, the Federal Reserve System, let all the banks fail. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll get to that.